Hello, welcome everyone to Navigating an Ancient Faith podcast. My name is David Gortney. I'm coming to you from the Tampa Bay area in Florida, and with me is J.R. Gortney, my brother, and he's coming to us from Tennessee.
That's right. Happy New Year, by the way.
Yeah, we are recording this on New Year's Day. So,
did you stay up till midnight?
I did not. My New Year's Eve tradition has been to try and sleep through all the fireworks in my neighborhood. So,
well, we don't have many fireworks, but no, I haven't stayed up till midnight for probably all the way back to 2000, Y2K. I was a little bit scared of that one, but no, I don't think I'm sure I have stayed up a couple times till midnight, but for the most part, no.
Yeah. My wife says our neighborhood sounds like Baghdad during July 4th or New Year's Eve. So It's a challenge to try and sleep, but I give it my best shot.
Yeah. Try to calm the dog down.
Yeah. He didn't go crazy barking this year, so that's good.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, so I keep wanting to say we just returned from Greece, but goodness, it's been 2.5 months now, even though—
Can you believe that?
I know, even though it feels like it was just a couple days ago. But so in October, you and I took a trip to Greece, and we wanted to, I guess, start the podcast series out by giving people an overview of the places we went. Now, I will say this is not going to be like take the family slide projector out and show 5 hours of home movies of Greece. So if you're listening, that's not what the intent here is, or the modern version is to say, hey, here's my iPhone. Look at these 500 pictures of Greece.
I was about to say, I think I've got about 1,500.
Yeah, 1,500.
That's what I counted. That's right.
Yeah, no one wants to do that. At some of the sites we went to, it's always funny to me, the person who's literally just recording everything, just walking through, recording everything. And I'm like, no one wants to see that home video,
I don't want to go back and see that of my own videos.
Yeah,
so I can't imagine anybody else does either. So
yeah, so that's not the intent of what we want to do here today, but we do want to give people an idea of where we went, because we're going to reference it in future podcasts as well. And we're going to talk about a couple specific sites that we went to and things that stood out. We don't want to rehash that, but just give people a little bit of an overview about where we went, because we will reference this in a couple future podcasts. And it might help just to give people an idea of the places we went, the things we visited. We were in mainland Greece. And so, today we're just going to talk about the places we went, maybe high-level thoughts about each place, what stood out to you, what stood out to me, and share that with our listeners.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So we flew in on a Saturday. It was pretty early, although by the time we got into Athens, actually, we still had the most part of a day, and then the next day in Athens. So we spent 2 days in Athens upon arrival in Greece, and we talked about a little bit about the Acropolis in Athens, things like that. What was your big takeaway from Athens did you have?
Man, it's so much there that it's difficult to summarize. I mean, there's obviously centuries of history. And I think what interests me most about Athens was kind of this intersection. And like I said, it's a huge intersection, because this is, centuries of history built on top of each other type thing. But I thought the fascinating thing was the intersection of history and myth. That there's obviously lots of history to understand, and to go back to Stoic philosophy and to go back to ancient Greek philosophy, so all that is fascinating, but it so clearly intersects with the mythology of the day, the understood mythology of Zeus and those types of things. And that played such a huge cultural role. And I guess you always knew it, because, Greek mythology, of course that tied into their culture. But when you're there, you see how instrumental and how integral it is into their culture, that it's built into every facet.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Every relief, every painting, every carving, it's everywhere. It's all over the city.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, that kind of ties into, I was thinking about what my takeaway is, besides, the Acropolis and that, was the idea of Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, where, Paul was said to, in the book of Acts, to have kind of shared the gospel with all of these philosophers. And, you and I were on Mars Hill. That's an interesting place to be, I thought, because it's a huge limestone outcropping, and it was so slippery up there that you and I were even joking around about how did Paul stand up here and teach, because we even passed some lady who had fallen down. It's so easy to fall up there now. Her head was bleeding. I felt bad for the woman, but that's kind of
so many people climb on it. It's turned into polished marble, pretty
right.
much. Yeah.
Literally so many people are up there climbing on it that it basically polishes the limestone and becomes just really slick. It's one of those things too. In the United States, you would not be allowed to walk on that.
No, that'd be banned. Yeah.
There'd be too much liability. But anyway, that aside, and then we walked down the kind of backside of Mars Hill, and we were talking about, I wonder where Paul really did teach. It probably wasn't on the rock because, again, it was so windy up there. So interesting discussion about where Paul might have taught, and you get some opinions about, well, yeah, they were up on the top of the rock, or everything was so different back then, or maybe it was down on the hillside where we were at.
Yeah, well, historically, it was a court of law, where they tried, homicides and violent crimes and things like that. And there were buildings up there. So, I think it was kind of just probably a nice solid foundation for several different buildings. And you're right that it not really on top, but all down, it was, that slope. There were plenty of, you can see the holes where columns used to be and things like that. So they used to have buildings all kind of down that slope.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I don't believe Paul was up on top giving a sermon, but probably down somewhere along the slope there. Since historically it was a court, more of a courtroom or a court of law type of area, that brings up the interesting idea of it was a little unclear whether Paul gave his speech before the Areopagus Council as part of like an investigation or a trial, or was it an informal speech? I thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's something I had not heard about either, because in the book of Acts, it seems clear that Paul is just up there giving a speech, kind of interacting with other philosophers. But we did see a couple of references that indicated that Paul might have been actually brought before the Areopagus for questioning, which that's not something in our tradition. That's not something I had heard before, but that was kind of interesting.
If that were the case, I'm sure it was more of an informal discussion, where I don't think it was formal charges or anything like that, but I did, just because of its history, thought that was kind of coincidental.
Yeah. Well, and to tie into what you said about the mythology that's all around the city, I think my big takeaway from Athens was at the end of Paul's sermon recorded in the book of Acts. It basically says that it indicated that Paul kind of moved on from Athens because he discerned that everyone just sat around and talked about all these ideas. And there was, you got the idea that Paul was just looking around going, yeah, I'm not going to make any inroads here, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit the road and move on. Because you might think, well, why didn't Paul set up shop in Athens? One of the most culturally influential cities in the world. But I think Paul quickly saw that, yeah, he's competing with all kind of mythology everywhere, philosophers, everyone who just wanted to sit around and talk and chat. And he just kind of thought, yeah, I'm going to move on. This place isn't going to be very fertile ground for the gospel.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because that's another thing we talked about while we were there, how it was interesting that this major city isn't really mentioned very much in his letters. And as far as we know, I guess there are no letters from Paul to a church in Athens. There was probably a church in Athens, or there certainly was a group of hopeful converts in Athens.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's all these small, the Corinthians and the Thessalonians and all these other little churches around the area. But this major city, he didn't seem to get much traction there. And it is interesting that as you walk around what we can see and what's been excavated, you can kind of see why. It was overwhelming to us, the amount of history, and it was probably overwhelming to Paul, the amount of, I don't know, the grip that the mythology had, and the fact that they accepted everything to the point that nothing is taken seriously, I think.
Yeah. So that was the main takeaway from Athens, I think, that both of us got, is having been there and seen just the symbolism and mythology everywhere, you can kind of understand why Paul just moved on. And of course, from there, Paul moved on to Corinth, and that's where we went next, which is about an hour and a half away. Then we spent just the day in Corinth. We spent the day in Corinth, but moved on. Now, it was the second time that you and I had been to Corinth.
Right.
So I'm interested in kind of what your perception was the second time around.
We have a short video of this, but when you go up on the Acrocorinth, which is this hill above the town, you can really take in the entire. You can see the Gulf of Corinth to your left, and then all the way to the Aegean Sea, about 3-4 miles away. And I think it put it in context for me, the idea that, because we heard that what they did is they brought boats into Corinth, and then they would roll the boats across this land bridge using logs, so they didn't have to sail all the way around the peninsula, and they would save days of sailing. But in the meantime, Corinth was known for sort of their immorality, and they're known for that. And when you thought of the idea of these boats coming in and these weary ship seamen coming in and wanting to take a break and wanting to blow off some steam while their boat is being dragged across the land bridge, you can really see that, this is kind of a Wild West bar town where people that come in and want to blow off some steam and kill a few days while their boat's being dragged. I don't know. It just put it in a little bit an interesting context for me that you could visualize that even today as you're standing on top of the Acrocorinth.
No, I agree with that. I think being there, you see all that so clearly, and then it makes sense why the church in Corinth struggled with, sexual immorality, and Paul had to keep saying, hey, knock this off, knock that off, because that was just kind of the nature of the town. I think you said it best, where you were like, this was almost kind of a New Orleans or a Las Vegas in the ancient world. And maybe that's
right.
Not accurate, but that's what it seems like when you do get that picture of boats are docking. You have 2 ports there. Boats are being dragged across. And you just have this town full of sailors that have 2 or 3 days to kill. And on top of the Acrocorinth, they have found this temple to Aphrodite that supposedly had, ritualistic prostitutes up there. And the whole thing, you get a clear picture of what Paul was dealing with in Corinth. Now, he spent a lot of time there and established a church there, but it kind of makes sense now when you look back and say, Paul had to deal with all kinds of mess going on in the Corinthian church there.
Yeah, that's right. And that the Corinthian church had a chance to be a light in a really dark place, I think.
Yeah.
Where the town was essentially built around entertaining and servicing these guys, these travelers and things like that, But I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So after spending the day in Corinth, we actually drove. Now, this was kind of off the beaten path, but we actually stayed in a little town that night called Kalavrita. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Turns out a little mountain town, beautiful drive in, because we wanted to go see this cave. But the next day on our way out of town, we had actually passed this monastery called Megaspileo Monastery. And that was kind of one of those accidental things that we ran across. But to me, that was absolutely fascinating to see that monastery.
It was our first kind of introduction to the first monastery we went to. But you're right. We went there for the Cave of Lakes, which sounded awesome.
Yeah.
But it probably wasn't worth the detour. The drive was absolutely amazing. You kind of wiggle up in these mountains.
Yeah, the drive was beautiful.
Yeah, but we stumbled on this monastery kind of on our way out. And the Megaspileo was, it means great cave. And it's kind of located on this sheer cliff. But it's right on this sheer cliff, and it's built on top of a cave. And we kind of stumbled in there at closing time. Again, it's this huge monastery. I think they said it had the ability to house like 200 monks, but only, how many did you say? 4? 2 or 4 were living there. Very few.
It's a very small number, that live there right now. And they each had their own floor or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they must have the setup. But anyway, go ahead and tell the story about the cave, because I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Well, so we went through, I guess, the museum part of the monastery and ended up back in the cave, where the story is that, in 200 AD, a shepherd girl found an icon in this cave. And the icon was believed to be the earliest icon of the Virgin Mary and Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that what was fascinating to me, especially coming from the way, you and I grew up, was they actually have this icon on display. And we ran into a guy who worked there who was actually closing up, but he was nice enough to kind of walk us around and lock up behind us and tell us what was going on. so that's why it was called the Great Cave Monastery or Megaspleo Monastery. But you could actually see this icon. It was obviously very old. And according to the guy we talked to,
fires and
survived several fires. They carbon dated it back to, what did he say, 120 AD?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the story was that it was actually carved by Luke.
And so there's the additional.
So that would have been even earlier. But I think, you're right. They did have it carbon dated.
Yeah, they carbon dated back to 120, but there was even additional tradition that said Luke may have carved it. And of course, Luke lived in Greece, most likely. So, maybe not that far-fetched. But I guess for me, it was just, I guess it was wrestling with this idea of the, I guess the rational side of me wanted to go, come on, we are really supposed to buy it. But at the same time, you're sitting here in Greece and you're staring at this thing that is obviously, almost 2,000 years old. And, the other part of me absolutely wanted just to embrace that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's one of those things that we don't really get as much in the United States, that we're so far removed from that area of the world that we tend to just kind of take the Bible and dig into that. But we don't have the local traditions. We don't have, we're not able to visit the sites in the United States, at least. And when you're there and you kind of hear this story, it kind of, part of me wanted to embrace that idea, And so we talked for pretty much the whole drive back. What if, because it was known that Luke was in that area. That was pretty strong tradition. Understood that he was in that area for several years, and it's the oldest monastery in Greece. They said that it had been.
That's right.
It looks modern. So the pictures, if you look at the pictures, it obviously looks like a modern hotel. That's because most of the monastery had been burnt a few times. So what's built back is fairly new. But it's the oldest monastery in Greece, and that was fascinating. It was a really neat experience to go through that.
Yeah, that was definitely a treat to run into that kind of off the beaten path. Not even plan to see something like that, but then to get to see something that was that impactful.
Yeah, that's right.
So the next day, then on our way out of the mountains there, we drove around the bay through Patros, and I think I always say that city wrong, but I think it's Patros, which is the end. Is that right?
That's what I called it. That's what I went
okay. That's what.
But
then we circled around.
Rolling up in Greece. I'm sure we butchered several pronunciations.
Right. So I think it was the city of Patros. There was that huge bridge, but then we drove around to the other side, to the north side of the bay, and we made our way up to Delphi, which has a long history. It's one of my favorite spots. But what did you take away from Delphi? Yeah,
it was another place of just centuries of history that's hard to wrap your head around. But what hit me about Delphi was this is where we kind of started to see our recurring theme on our trip, the ascent, and we have another podcast about that. But that idea that we kept seeing this recurring theme of climbing and casting your eyes upward, and so people would come to see the oracle there, and they would climb up, and they would, make this ascent. And so that's where that theme kind of started to form there, and that just carried on throughout the entire trip. But as far as the place, it was just another one of those, I'll say, a difficult intersection of mythology and history, where you kept hearing things like, they found this rock in Delphi. The reason has its significance, I suppose, is that they found this rock in Delphi that they call the navel of the world, and it's this carved rock that Zeus, I forget the exact story. Zeus decided to find where the center of the world is, and he threw a stone as far as he could, and an eagle located it and identified it. So it's another one of these kind of mystical stories behind an actual place, and it kind of forces your mind to say, what? Here we are, we're in this town. This is the understood history of Delphi, and its significance is tied to Zeus. But it was just, yeah, it was just difficult for me to wrap my head around the significance of the intersection of the myth and the actual history of it. But the history is fascinating too. You actually read a book on it, and I believe I've
Right.
ordered the same book about the Oracle, which completely was I didn't know. I've heard the Oracle of Delphi that referenced plenty of times in modern culture and things like that, but
Hmm.
I didn't really understand the whole back story to it, and so I'm interested in reading more about that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the Oracle of Delphi is very well known. I think the place was operational for about 1,000 years, and the Oracle at Delphi, of course, there were other oracles in the ancient world, but the Oracle at Delphi was the most highly regarded, revered for her wisdom, for her mysterious sayings for about 1,000 years. And leaders of the ancient world, generals, all went to seek advice and counsel from the Oracle at Delphi. And so there's a huge history there. I guess the thing that I think something you said, it kind of makes you almost uncomfortable and struggle with this idea of how much of this do you really believe? And it's easy from our perspective to say, well, the ancients were superstitious and they believed all these silly myths. But when you're there was definitely something more to it than that. And
Well, you just don't build cities for thousands of years around myths. It's
yeah,
one thing to
yeah,
have a story, to have a tall tale. It's another thing to have obviously generations of people that come here, and that is how myths get started or stories get started. But yeah, to see so much of a history there, that's what was, like I said, difficult for me to
yeah,
wrap my head around.
yeah. I was talking to a buddy of mine after, and I was telling him about Delphi, and he said, so what is it? Is it just a big scam or what? And, it's funny that he asked me that, because that's kind of the tension you're left with is, and my comment to him was like, no, I think there's more to it than that. And whether it was the combination of ancient wisdom and philosophy that was there, because there were some well-known philosophers that also made their home there and kind of shared in the wisdom of the oracle. So
Right.
whether it was this kind of ancient idea of philosophy and wisdom that was housed there, whether the ancients had this understanding of maybe the heavenly realm, I guess we would say, more so than we do.
Yeah.
Maybe our rational scientific minds have closed ourselves off to the possibility of just being aware of more the spiritual realm, what's going on around you. But I think, I mentioned this, I think the first night we were there, is as a Christian, it's like, I don't really know what to do with all this, but it was definitely an incredible place to learn the history of and experience and just understand why it was on the map for 1,000 years in
Yeah.
ancient history.
Yeah, it was kind of the Area 51 of the ancient world. That there's
Yeah.
there's plenty of crackpots and kooks around the area capitalizing on the mythology and I'm sure there was plenty of that. But underneath it, you're also thinking, there's too much, there's too many facts, there's too many things going on, that there's something going on here. That was sort of my take when
Yeah.
I left.
Yeah, that's a good that's about the best way to sum it up. There's something going on here that we don't understand, and maybe never
right.
will, but yeah.
Yeah, we didn't see any UFOs. So we'll clarify that, right?
Yeah, no UFOs. Well, we left the next day, and actually someone at a bookshop, it was another one of those interesting things, at a bookshop in Delphi asked us where we were headed next, and we said, well, we're going to the Meteora region of Greece. And he said, well, if you're going to Meteora, he goes, you're going to pass right by Thermopylae.
Mhm.
And both of us just looked at each other and say, okay, we have to stop at Thermopylae. And so
Yeah, absolutely.
we stopped at Thermopylae and then ended the day up at Meteora, which is an incredible region. I know it was your favorite part of the trip.
Oh yeah. Well, it's a difficult place to summarize because it's such a beautiful place, while kind of at the same time, really kind of almost mysteriously not having much history until like the 9th century. When the monks kind of first started arriving there and building these monasteries up in the mountains. But yeah, it was kind of interesting going there and seeing. Well, like I said, it just takes our breath away. With the first night, we went up, caught a sunset up on one of these rocks,
Mhm.
and you're just taking in the whole scene. this is one of those things you're just going to have to take a look at the pictures that we post or Google it yourself. It looks like something out of Lord of the Rings, something like that. Speechless is kind of my best description. But as far as what I took away from that place, it was absolutely gorgeous. But at the same time, I don't know if you had the same thought. It was like not much is in the sense of antiquity, how it tied into the Bible, because it's not really mentioned. Like I said, it wasn't really a relevant place until
I think
8th or 9th century, something like that.
Yeah, I think even later than that, but yeah. For me, it was the combination of unbelievable beauty and maybe in the show notes, we'll post some pictures, or I know we have a video on our website, Navigating Ancient Faith, that we shot at Meteora, but just Google images, just Google Meteora, and these incredible rock outcroppings. And on the top of these rock formations, monks built monasteries that seem to just emerge right out of the rock. So on one hand, you have this incredible beauty, but on the other hand, I was really taken by the whole monastic lifestyle, and you really came face to face with it. So in some sense, I think Meteora was overwhelming just because it was overwhelming beauty, but then you were kind of overwhelmed with the monastic dedication and going through these monasteries and seeing the incredible chapels, the icons, the dedication to the life, I think was also overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
It was hard to take in.
Well, I have my ideas of what I thought a monk was until I went there, and there's some books that we had about the construction efforts, and they used ropes and climbed sheer cliffs and built these things by themselves. They didn't have contractors come in and build it for them. And so, I left thinking, man, my thought of the little bald monk that, the humble guy, I was like, no, these guys were tougher than you thought, at least back then, to be able to pull this off. But that idea of there's something about if the monasteries weren't there was still something about looking up, because the first, when you came in, we didn't see many monasteries because they're kind of on the backside a little bit, but there's something about those rock sheer cliffs that call you to build here. You know what I mean? That calls you to higher, and of course the monastic idea of separating themselves. This they had to have come to that place and said, this is where we get separation. This is exactly what we're looking for,
Right.
Climb these cliffs and live the separatist lifestyle, which ironically now is again, these monasteries that are built for 100, 200 people, and they've got two or three monks living there and thousands of visitors every day.
Of tourists,
tourists rolling through there. That was sort of an ironic juxtaposition for what they were built for.
True. And there were a couple of nunneries there as well, which was interesting because you had actually the combination of monasteries and nunneries. But each one only had a handful of occupants to it, but then you just had, thousands of tourists going through. And
well, the nunneries, they seem to be dozens and dozens of nuns there, which I don't know what that means, but it's like, there were the nunneries. I don't know if they were full. They were essentially full, but then the monasteries, were very few people. But I interrupted you there.
No, well, just the contrast of, living this kind of devout, isolated lifestyle, but it's almost like a zoo exhibit because just tourists are constantly streaming through and, looking at where you live and just the beautiful place you live. So maybe that's why it's not much of a retreat for monastics anymore. But
maybe. I could see that. I could see that being the situation. That's right.
Yeah. But an absolutely must place to visit if you ever go to mainland Greece is Meteora.
And there's a train, this is just for tourists, there's a train that runs between Athens and Meteora that we didn't realize till afterwards. So if you happen to get to Athens, which is where everybody goes to in Greece, man, it's definitely worth taking a day and taking the train up to Meteora.
Yeah.
Once in a lifetime experience.
Yes, definitely. So the next spot on our itinerary was we stayed at a town called Litochoro, which its significance, it was at the base of Mount Olympus. So we went to spend a couple days in the Mount Olympus region. And again, Mount Olympus is one of those that you can see why it was chosen kind of to be home of the gods, why the 12 Olympic gods were said to live on top of Mount Olympus, because it was absolutely spectacular. It rose right off of the coast, one of the highest points in Greece. And we had fun just messing around in the mountains a couple days there.
Yeah, it was, like you said, it just shaped like a throne. Again, it's not, they weren't huge mountains like you think of, if you've been to the Rocky Mountains or something like that, or certainly the Alps, or, it's not a massive mountain range or anything like that. It's kind of just this mountain, but it did have this kind of majestic cove feature that had the 12 peaks that, it really did kind of play into that idea of, this is the throne of Zeus and the Olympians all live up there. And it met our expectation because, again, I don't even think it's the highest peak in Greece.
Yeah, I think that's
mountain,
right.
But it did have that kind of majestic quality to it that just kind of, you could see why the gods lived up there. How about that?
Right. Yeah. It made sense why that myth was attached to Mount Olympus, why the gods lived there. Yeah. Attached to that was kind of happened the next day. There was an archaeological site called Dion. And
this was another accidental discovery.
Another
planned. It was great.
Yeah. I think for me, it's one of the things that made this trip so memorable is all the accidental discoveries, like off the itinerary things that we stumbled into that we just thought,
no doubt.
Oh my goodness. Like, what if we had skipped this,
Yeah.
But
how does TripAdvisor not have this?
Yeah. How do none of the websites talk about this site? But Dion, actually probably the original gateway city to Mount Olympus was Dion. And it was funny because we found the site. We said, well, let's spend an hour here. And we walked through what looked like just a cow pasture and kind of disappointed almost. There were a couple of bricks that said, Temple of Zeus. And we're like, it's a couple stones. But then we crossed over the road and found this huge, sprawling archaeological site that was one of the biggest sites I've ever seen. And it started to
immense.
Impress upon you just the size of what this ancient city, Dion, how big it must have been, and really served as the gateway to Mount Olympus in ancient times.
Yeah, the city was dedicated to Zeus, I believe. And when we were walking around, like you said, we kind of in this pasture area and were a little bit unimpressed until we got into the larger archaeological site that I didn't really, you couldn't see it from the road. It looked like the smaller part of it, but it was just, I'll tell you what, it was a good understanding of why archaeology is so difficult. Because I think you and I had said, we'd been to plenty of these little sites kind of almost like on the side of the road. And you're like, man, how come nobody's out here digging this up, excavating this? How come there's not, government money or colleges from the States sending people over to dig this stuff up because of its significance? And Dion was a great example of, by the time we were done walking it, we walked, what was it? Maybe not even a third of it, maybe a quarter of it. Was excavated down to the road, and they were, we walked around the walls of it. The outer walls have all been excavated, and it was just, it seemed like miles of this outer wall, and most of it's woods that you and I just kept looking over there and saying, do you realize what's underneath all that dirt? And, it was just a massive site, and it gave me a good appreciation for, you can't dig everything up at once, and it's why these things take decades to put a dent in, and it was really clear at Dion,
Yeah. The two things I took away from was, first, walking around the city walls, I remember seeing a statue of a woman that had broken in half, and I remember seeing this statue just lying in the grass and thinking this would be in a museum anywhere else. Because it probably is like, it's probably like 2,000 years old. Or something. It was obviously old, and it fit kind of the other statues that we saw in the main archaeological area. But it's just laying in the grass, and you're thinking anywhere else but Greece, this thing is in a museum. And
you and I could have snuck in there at night, right up there at night, because again, it wasn't inside the park. Yeah, we could have dug it up and taken it and sit in our living room. It was just nuts.
Disclaimer: we did not do that. So
I
You're
could
not,
get back. Yeah, we could.
yeah,
It would have been over the 50-pound rule to
right,
fly it
right.
back. So yeah.
But the other thing that struck me as we were walking through the site talking is you and I said, well, how come Dion is never mentioned in the Bible? Or how come actually Dion is not more well known even among Greece sites? Because it's a huge area. And they had clearly built a museum and another structure to house this absolutely beautiful mosaic that they found there. They clearly had built it up in anticipation of tourists, and it just wasn't clicking yet. And you and I were joking around, but I think we're actually onto something, is that it's because it was never mentioned in the Bible.
Right.
So all of the religious tourist pilgrimages just skip over Dion because, what's the biblical significance of that? But one of the things I read upon our return was that actually when Paul left, I think, Berea, it said he went to the coast and then took a boat to Athens. I think I'm remembering this correct. Mm-hmm. And the commentary I read said basically the only place from Berea where he could have caught a ship at the coast would have been Dion. And so Paul probably actually did pass through Dion. It would have been another one of those kind of incredible cities. And actually, I think you brought up a good point. It was the city of Zeus because Dion, the Greek word would be Dios, which is basically the city of the god, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And so maybe it was one of those places, again, that you go, man, why didn't Paul set up shop here? But maybe he just looked at it, and I mean, this is the heart of the Olympic gods and the temples
right
there.
At the base of the mountain, sure.
And maybe Paul just thought this is not going to be fruitful ground either.
Yeah, if he just would have name dropped him in one of the letters, it would have been been a fully excavated site. It would have been looked a lot more like Philippi, right?
Right. There would have been all kinds of church money flowing in, excavate this site because it's so important in the Bible. But just because actually it's Luke's fault, right? He didn't name drop Dion.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So it's just kind of this obscure city, but it was an amazing site.
Oh,
it was an amazing site.
It was really neat. Yeah, absolutely.
So from Dion, we actually drove through Thessaloniki, but we were on our way to Philippi. And Philippi was, again, one of my favorite spots because we were starting to wonder if we were actually in the right area. I didn't see any signs for Philippi. I was starting to get worried. Google Maps was saying we're almost there, and I'm thinking, man, is there anything here to see?
Right.
Well, it did not disappoint because, for one thing, the modern town isn't that big, but it's named Chronides, I think. So all the signs were saying Chronides, and we didn't realize we were actually headed to Philippi, and Philippi is the archaeological site. But amazing 2 or 3 days in the Philippi Kavala region.
Yeah, and thanks to our hotel host, he enlightened me on history of the area, and he really intersected for me the history of, Philip of Macedonia, and obviously that's what it was named after, and Paul's preaching there, the baptismal site of Lydia, and he told us about this is also the traditional site where Persephone got pulled into the underworld by Hades, which was fascinating to us. I mean, we talked about this all night long, this idea that Paul's goal was to overlay the existing mythological culture with a Christian significant event, and his goal was to kind of wipe out the existing culture with modern Christian events. And so this is where Lydia was baptized, the town right around the corner, probably not even a quarter mile was the little town of Lydia. And he just tied that together in a way that just kind of helped me really appreciate Philippi, first of all, and also to appreciate what Paul was probably doing in the time. And we even talked about how, you wonder if Paul kind of got his people together and said, hey, we're going to baptize Lydia. Where can we do it? And somebody brought up, that mythological site where Persephone got pulled in the underworld, and Paul just pointed at him and said, yep, that's what we're doing. This is going to be perfect. This plays perfectly into what we're trying to do. But anyway, it's kind of that big narrative that he tied together in a really interesting way. So I think Philippi was special for me just because that was a place where several of these things got tied neatly together.
Yeah. And if you look at the book of Acts, it says they landed in Neapolis and then went to Philippi. And the modern city of Neapolis is called Kavala. And one of the things that was interesting to me was that our hotel owner, who actually provided so much insight for our time there, he was great. He even cooked us a meal. It was delicious. But one of his things was that all the tourists want to stay in Kavala because it's the beach town, right? And then they drive in, spend an hour or two at the side of Philippi, and then go back to the beach. But his opinion was that's a mistake because there's just so much you miss by being in that area. There's so much history there. I thought it was fascinating, that little hill where Mark Antony led his troops against Cassius and Brutus.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was there. We saw other things. We saw cave drawings there.
Yeah.
He showed us, took us out to a field and showed us drawings that we saw pictures of it in a museum later. And it was just out.
We just walked up to it out in, again, kind of like a cow pasture.
Yeah. So besides the whole history of Philippi and the biblical significance, the whole context of the area and how much history is there, just really kind of blew me away. You learned so much there, and our hotel owner was like having a history lecture, sit down with you every morning and go, okay, here's what you need to know before you set out for the day, which was absolutely fantastic. It was fantastic.
Yeah. It's worth going back just to catch up with him, and have him teach us every night, because it's just second nature to him. And that's the other thing you realize when you live in an area, if you live in Philadelphia or something like that, you just were brought up with the history of the United States and all that's part of your day-to-day discussions and things like that. And it was neat talking to him because it was so clearly ingrained, the history and the intersection of the Bible. And it was just neat to see it kind of in someone's life that lives it every day and sees it every day. And you could tell that it's just like, was one of his passions, It was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think it really impressed upon me, I love taking these trips because I'm always taking them with the eye of what can I learn from being there that I can't learn in a commentary or a website. And a guy like that and some of the other locals that we encountered really drove home this idea of there's so much more you can learn if you just go to a place. Not everyone can do that. We realize that. That's actually why Navigating an Ancient Faith exists, is to actually try and bring some of that to people who can't go there. But it was one of those places that, going there was no substitute for going there and having the conversations that we had and seeing the things that we did, because a lot of it you're not going to see in a guidebook.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, so then from Philippi, we drove about an hour and a half to Thessaloniki, which is, of course, the biblical city of Thessalonica. The thing about Thessaloniki that blew me away was it was just so different from any place else we had been, because it was a modern city. It was a busy city.
Yeah.
It was a happening city. I mean, 1 a.m. and, the restaurants are packed and people are on the sidewalk. It was the furthest thing you could think of from being at like a biblical archaeological site, and yet there we were.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And in the middle of right in the middle of downtown, there'd be one block where there's no buildings and it's just an archaeological site. In fact, one of the things I think we were commenting on, the interesting thing about Thessaloniki is that it looks like it was a major town in the 70s, something like that. It's kind of frozen in the 70s, the architecture and things like that. And I think one of the things, I think we're right about this. I should have looked this up. I think we're right about this, is that the reason that the architecture is 50 years old is, my guess is, anytime something was needed to be renovated, you ran the risk of archaeologists coming in there and saying, hey, before you start building back this building, let's take a look underneath, And they probably lost the property because it was a vast city, and we went to the museum there that was the best part. The most educational part of Thessaloniki was the museum there, because it laid out the walls and, the sides of the city. And of course, now it's just a major city built on top of it. But yeah, I think that it's stuck in the 70s because you probably can't tear anything down, because they'll find an archaeological site and you'll lose your property. That's my guess.
Yeah, no question. So they found the Roman Forum, and it used to be a bus station. I did find out that after we got back. It used to be the bus station. They tore the bus station down, and then lo and behold, wow, we found the old Roman Forum. And
There you go.
I
Lost
can
the bus
imagine,
station.
yeah. I can imagine the whole city's like that. And you look around and it's this big city, and yeah, anywhere you dig, I'm sure you're going to find an archaeological site. So just, nobody digs anymore.
Yeah. But right on the water, it was gorgeous. It was a great end to the trip. That was our final destination. We flew out of Thessaloniki, but it was a perfect end because just the waterfront, kind of the hustle and bustle of the city, and then the museum. It was great.
And in Thessaloniki, without seeing, this big archaeological site that we saw other places, one thing that really was impressed upon me there is the connection to Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great. I mean, there were huge statues of them there. We saw indications that even in Thessaloniki today, maybe there's more of an identification with this kind of ancient region of Macedonia.
Right.
Almost more so than being Greek. Now, I don't know if that's correct, but that was one of the impressions that I left with. And the other thing is, standing on the waterfront, you could actually look across the bay and see Mount Olympus.
Right.
And that was another thing that I had no idea of, kind of the distances
Scale.
between sites, that when Paul is ministering in Thessalonica, he would look across the bay and he could see Dion and Mount Olympus.
Yeah, and point to it. And yeah, I mean, it was sort of like our trip to Jerusalem or Israel. It's one thing to look it up on a globe. It's another thing to stand there and to know that it only took us 15 minutes or 30 minutes to get from the Dead Sea, and we saw Jericho off to our right to get into Jerusalem. It's like, my goodness, this place is not much bigger than West Tennessee or something like that. Places that you're familiar with, and it sets the scale of, it really shrinks it down. And I think, maybe it's from growing up in the United States and, to go to the Grand Canyon, it'd take you 2 days to drive out there. And, everything seems so spread out. It's so compact over there, which makes perfect sense because they walked everywhere. And it was just kind of interesting to see how quickly we could get from place to place. And of course, you're envisioning, sure, Paul walked from here to there, and it would have been faster to take a boat across from Dion over to Thessaloniki instead of walking the coast. And I don't know, it just put it in such a context and a scale. Maybe I'm a visual thinker, because that's what made it real to me is once I'm in a place, I can kind of orient myself, and it really does kind of bring it home how close everything was. And that he could see Mount Olympus from Thessalonica and point to it in his teachings and things like that. It's just kind of a fascinating end of the trip.
Yeah. And one of the things that I would kind of wrap up saying is that I was almost fascinated with the cities that weren't mentioned in the Bible as the cities that were, in some sense, because we kept going places and we would say, why isn't this mentioned? Why isn't this mentioned? Then later you go, well, Paul did probably pass through there, but it's not mentioned. And even Delphi, Delphi's only like an hour and a half away from Athens, and Corinth for that matter. And you think, well, surely Paul must have been curious about what's going on in Delphi.
Yeah, you could see Delphi from Corinth because it's across the bay.
Right.
On a clear day, sure.
So I think that was one of my main takeaways, is just, it's fascinating to me to think about why cities are mentioned in the Bible, but then why some aren't, and we would have picked Athens and Dion and Delphi, but for whatever reason, Paul chose not to, start churches there or spend time there or minister there. And it was just fascinating to kind of think through that.
Yeah. And certainly a place like Delphi, you can see why Paul probably moved on. He might have perhaps visited, but he's moving on from that place pretty quick. But no, I did kind of think that in Athens, we really talked about that. The idea that even today, you kind of see all these versions of every school of thought is accepted. And Paul realized that probably wasn't fertile ground. And, obviously, was it Dionysus was converted there. So it's not like nothing ever happened in Athens, or you never gave it a shot. But it is interesting that the ancient cities that we all talk about today, obviously tied to Paul's letters, seem to be less relevant than other cities that were around it, even in the ancient day.
Yeah. And Paul does set up shop in some pretty significant cities, Ephesus being one of them.
Oh, sure.
But yeah, there's a lot of cities that, seem a little bit less important than they were in antiquity. And I think that's right. Paul kind of discerned where the fertile ground was and where he would just be wasting his time, So that was really interesting to me.
But then Corinth dispels that myth a little bit.
Yeah,
because it was probably a rough town, and he spent a lot of time there,
Well,
So
and there
it
were a
is
lot of
interesting
problems there as well.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's a light in a dark world. It is interesting to think about what kind of went through his mind about where he stayed and where he moved on. Yeah, it was an absolutely amazing trip.
Yeah.
I think I enjoyed this trip better than the first trip as far as, we stayed in Greece. The first time we came, we went to Turkey. But just sort of renting the car and sort of taking that the path we took. We were saying we'd like to go to the Peloponnese next time, go a little bit further down. But just the path we took, I thought was great. And it really kind of put into perspective. We hit all of the major Greek cities that Paul was, wrote letters that had some sort of archaeological sites. Some of them are fairly covered up.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps things up. Thanks for going on our trip with us a little bit. We are going to spend the next couple podcasts talking specifically about some of the, I think you specifically mentioned this major theme of the ascent, and we'll spend a couple of podcasts talking about that. Another podcast, kind of what our main takeaway from the trip was, because I think we had a great conversation the last night where we talked about that, and we want to get that down on a podcast as well. But hopefully this just oriented you to the trip, sets the stage for a couple of podcasts coming up.
Yeah, and we'll have pictures up on our website. Take a look at that. You can kind of follow along the pictorial path. Is our map still up? Is that still a thing?
It is. It's still up, yes.
Yeah, good. So you can actually see a map of where we went, what we saw on what days. That's a kind of an interactive journey that would probably be helpful to go along with this podcast. Yeah.
Yes. That's on navigatinganancientfaith.com. That's our website. There are little video snippets on there. There's city profiles of Thessaloniki, Philippi, Corinth now, and Athens. Yeah, there's an article with our map itinerary with it. So there's a lot of material on the website. So check the website out. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss anything. And we'll talk to you next time.